So I'm sitting with my son yesterday, and he's reading his social studies textbook, and it says, Luther leads the Reformation. And he reads for about 15 minutes, and he looks up and he says, I don't care about this, and I don't get it. Dad, I need some help. Okay, great. So I sat down with him, and I am by no means an expert on any of this. However, I talked with him and I started to read a little bit, and I said, okay, setting the stage. Okay, so this part of the textbook is kind of going to build the big picture here for us. Okay, so I started to read and I said, all right, by the 10th century, the Roman Catholic Church had come to dominate religious life in Northern and Western Europe. Okay, so my son said, you know what, Dad, I really don't care. I don't want to know about all of this history, especially back in the 10th century. And I started to explain to him, listen, not for anything. There are going to be times in life when you need to read material and understand it in order to use it. And no matter what job you have, you're going to read things that you don't want to read. You're going to have to write things you don't want to write. So let's move past that and let's understand this so you can use it for whatever you need to use it for in a test, etc., to write an essay. So basically here they're talking about the Roman Catholic Church and how it came to dominate religious life in this area of the world at that time. However, the church had not won universal approval. Well, that's big. Okay, that's saying, listen, there's a problem here. They didn't have everyone's approval. Over the centuries, many people criticized its practices. So the things that they were doing were being criticized. People did not approve of them. They felt that church leaders were too interested in worldly pursuits, like gaining wealth and political power. Okay, so they wanted to be rich and they wanted to have control over people. Even though the church made some reforms or changes, that's another word for reforms, during the Middle Ages, people continued to criticize it. Prompted by the actions of one man, that criticism would lead to rebellion. So there's this one man who's starting to really make noise and start to put out there that there are things that are a problem with the church. Okay, so then we get to this new section here, causes of the Reformation. By 1500, additional forces weakened the church. So now there's a weakening of the church. The Renaissance emphasis on the secular and the individual challenged church authority. So there's this time period where there are certain parts of the church and certain individuals who are now challenging it. Okay? And the people who are in charge, they're challenging that authority. The printing press spread these secular ideas. Well, we know that a printing press can make copies of the written word, and so they made copies, and apparently they spread them. In addition, some rulers began to challenge the church's political power. And here this is a follow-up. For example, in Germany, which was divided into many competing states, it was difficult for the Pope or the Emperor to impose central authority. So it started to get really difficult. There's a problem here. Finally, northern merchants, they resented paying church taxes to Rome. So taxes are going to Rome, to the church, and there's a problem with it. So they started to resent it. Oh my goodness. Spurred by these social, political, and economic forces, a new movement for religious reform began, and it swept much of Europe. So now they're going to talk about the criticism. That's why they break it up right here. They're going to talk about these criticisms. So here they are, the critics. The critics of the church claimed that its leaders were corrupt. They said that their leaders were doing bad things. Corruption is bad, bad news. The popes who ruled during the Renaissance patronized the arts. That means they went to all kinds of operas and things like that where they were spending money and doing things for themselves. They spent extravagantly on personal pleasure, all for themselves. They were doing things that they were only looking out for themselves and having a good time with it, and to fight wars. And here in the writing, they follow up and they say Pope Alexander VI, for example, admitted that he had fathered several children. Well, we do know that popes are not supposed to be doing that. Many popes were too busy pursuing worldly affairs to have much time for spiritual duties. Say, how could that be? How could they have too much time? Isn't the whole idea of what they do is that they have spiritual duties? Then the next one goes to the lower clergy. So these are other priests and clergymen who are underneath the Pope. They had problems as well. Many priests and monks were so poorly educated that they could scarcely read, let alone teach people. Well, wait a second. If they didn't have a good education, how could they teach people? That makes a big question, right? And then others broke their vows by marrying, which they're not supposed to be doing. They're not supposed to be marrying. They're not supposed to father children. And then some drank to excess. And here they're talking about alcoholic beverage and gambled. They spent money, the tax dollars that came from what they were talking about over early calls for reform. So before, what I was saying was the lower clergy had problems as well. Many priests and monks were so poorly educated that they could scarcely read, let alone teach people. Well, if you can't read and you don't have an education, how could you teach people? Others broke their vows by marrying. Well, they're not supposed to marry, and they're not supposed to have kids. And some drank to excess or gambled. And they're not supposed to be gambling money. That's against the rules. Early calls for reform, and remember, reform means change. So people are saying we need a big change here. So influenced, by these reformers or change makers, people had come to expect higher standards of conduct from priests, as they should, and church leaders. In the late 1300s and early 1400s, John Wycliffe of England and John Hus of Bohemia had advocated church reform, so they talk about certain individuals. They denied that the Pope had the right to worldly power, especially if he was acting that way. They also taught that the Bible had more authority than the leaders. So they're saying, listen, this is the book by which we are living by, and it's demonstrating the examples and telling the stories of the past and the leaders are not exhibiting the behaviors that it's saying. In the 1500s, Christian humanists like Desiderius, Erasmus, and Thomas More added their voices to this chorus of criticism. So they're adding to the criticism, and the criticism is increasing. In addition, many Europeans were reading religious works. Remember, if they're reading these religious works, it had to do with the printing press. The printing press allowed them to do that and form their own opinions about the church. The atmosphere in Europe was ripe for reform or change during this time. So then it got into where Luther challenges the church. And Martin Luther's parents wanted him to be a lawyer, so they give a little history. Instead, he became a monk and a teacher. From 1512 until his death, he taught scripture, so this is all his thing. All he wanted to be was a good Christian, not lead a religious revolution. And then it got into talking about his 95 Theses. So it's interesting the way that this book is set up. First, they have the big picture. Then they talk about causes of the Reformation. And here it's kind of like there's a detail, okay, 2a, criticisms of the Catholic Church. And then here, this is another section of it where they start to call about early calls for reform before they move into how there's a specific person here. He's challenging the church. So that was what I did with my son, and I spent a lot of time on this in order to get him to understand it. I hope this was helpful to you.